Hi everyone, I'm Sharon. This is Heritage Journals. Thanks so much for joining me again as we work on our slow stitch junk journal cover. So I've been working on this one and I've added a bunch of embellishments. I'm going to just quickly show you what those are and how I've added them. So to begin with, I've sewn down all of the additional pieces. So this ribbon, hopefully you can see the stitching on it there. I've just done a bunch of tiny little stitches all over the red. It holds it down, but it also, to me, gives it a pretty watery almost kind of feel. I've added in on this little, by the fish here, the wavy blue lines, and that's just a laced running stitch. And then here I just added in a few yellow X's. There was a piece, the corner of this fabric here, felt like it needed to be tacked down a little bit more, and also this area here felt like it needed just a little bit more color. So that's why I chose to do that. Now for my little girl, you can see that I've just added tiny stitches all the way around, and I've done that on both the blue bottom level and then as well on the white level. So she's stitched down all the way around. And I've done the same thing for this blue floral piece that goes through the center. I've just added very tiny stitches, and I was wondering if this would work because I didn't have the green floss in the kit, but actually I just did it with the blue and it's completely fine. It's so, the stitches are very tiny and you don't really notice them even unless you look really close. The other thing I did was on this piece up here, I added some extra stitching just to emphasize the pattern, and that's just a running stitch all the way around. So it tacks it down a little bit more, but it also gives it a little bit more of a quilted effect. And then in here, again, I just felt like this needed a bit more color, and this piece of fabric needed to be tacked down a little bit more, so I just added some yellow stitches there. Again, that laced running stitch over here, because we had a lot of red here and we had red here and here, but it felt like it needed a little bit of something here, and I thought that red worked well for that. And then up here where these little houses and the lighthouse and the boats were, I again just sewed those down with tiny stitches all the way around the edge. I added the lace with tiny stitches, and then I added some French knots just in a few places just to give it a little bit of extra detail. And then there were places such as here on the edge where these fabrics were kind of just butted up against each other and they were a bit separating. So I just did some uneven stitching, just the stab stitching, which is like the running stitch, but it doesn't run, along the edges of those, just to give it a little bit of reinforcement, but it always also looks decorative, which I like. And for the little basket, I attached it as well with just tiny stitches all the way around. And then this middle part kind of puffed out in a way I didn't like, so I just did a bunch of tiny little stitches in the middle of that. And so I still have to add the sequins in here, but there's a reason I haven't done that yet. And then down here, I added this little white wheel-shaped piece of lace, and it was pretty, but it didn't stand out very much, so I just added in some X's all around the edges, and I really like the look of that. And it will also have a button in the middle, which I also haven't put on yet. And this section right here, I felt like it really needed more color for one thing, and it also was these pieces of fabrics were kind of separating, so I wanted to do something to reinforce that and join it together. So I just did these little wonky squares all the way through, and they're very simple to do. You just make a square. Like, they're not fancy, they're not planned out. I just try to make them look sort of random. And then again in here, felt like it needed a little bit more reinforcement, so I just did a few of the tiny little running stitches there. So you can see that it really is just something that kind of comes together as you go. And if you see a spot where you're not thrilled with how it looks, you can just add something there. So that's what I'm going to work on today, is finishing this up. But before I do that, I'm going to trim it. So that's why I didn't add the sequins or the buttons, because the easiest way to trim it is to use a ruler so that you get nice straight edges. And it's difficult to lay a ruler down when you've got things sticking up. These sequins don't come up too far, so they'll probably be fine. But I didn't want to add buttons or anything just yet because I think that would make it too bulky in order to make the ruler work well. So the ruler that I'm going to use is a quilting ruler. And quilting rulers are quite thick if you've never seen one before. And they're meant for use with a rotary cutter so that your blade can push up against the edge here and not slip off like it does. It could with a thin regular depth ruler. So I'm going to use this one. If you don't have a quilting ruler and a rotary cutter, that's totally fine. What I would suggest is doing what I'm doing today, but just marking it with pen, and then you could cut it with scissors. So just use a ruler, mark it with pen, and then trim it off until you get a good shape. So that's what I'm going to work on now. The one thing about quilting rulers is that they can be very long, not always, but sometimes they are. So I'm going to start on top and get this top line nice and straight. So with a quilting ruler, you'll see that there's lines going this way as well. So in order to get the corners square, you want to line up. I'll push this over a little bit. You want to line up one of these lines and with the side, and then you want to line this up with the top. So I'm going to put it about there. So that's going to give a fairly square top. So you can see that we'll be trimming a little bit of the fabric off, but not very much. So I'm going to do that now. And if you are using a rotary cutter and a ruler, please be really careful. These are incredibly sharp. So I'll pull that off. Don't throw it away. And let's see what that looks like a little bit closer. So you can see that looks like I've cut a knot that I had too close to the edge. So that's what happens, but that's okay. There's a big long piece left here. We'll just tuck that under when we do the next portion of it. But you can see here that this actually gives it a pretty nice straight top, which is where we want to start. Now I'm going to do the front, this side next. And so if you're using a quilting ruler, you want to line it up so that one of these top lines is straight with the edge you've already cut, which I believe it is. And then you want to move it over, keeping this line straight so you know you're getting a square cut here on the corner, and then cut it down the edge. And I think that will work right about there. So we'll do that. And yeah, that worked nice as well. So if I still had white pieces showing, or if it looked unpleasant, I guess, on the edge, unpleasant to me, I would just trim it a little bit more. But for now, that works. Okay, so now we're going to do the bottom. And I don't want to cut this lace that I've added on, so I want to make sure that the bottom is below that, and that this edge is lined up with the line so that I know this is going to be a square cut. And then I'm going to do this. Now, what I'm doing is not what you should be doing. So I'm going to say, do as I say, not as I do. The reason I'm doing it this way is so that you can see the whole thing, but normally never cut towards yourself with a rotary cutter. It would be better to turn this on its side and do it. but I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to do it this way, take my chances, and there, that's what I've done. So you can see at the bottom here, there is a little bit of the white backing showing through, just kind of in that one spot. So I'm going to see if I can trim just a touch more off, just to get rid of that, but still keep it below the lace. Okay, so let's see if that worked any better. And it did. You can see that there's very little white that shows, just this little bit below the lace, but that's going to get covered up when we attach it to the backing and do the edge stitching all around. So I'm happy with how that looks. And for this last edge, I'm going to turn it over, and this is how you should actually ideally be cutting if you're using a quilting ruler, is along either the right side or the left side, depending on whether you're left-handed or right-handed, so that you're always cutting away from yourself. So again, I'm going to line up the bottom here straight with the edge that's already been cut, and then I just need to pull it in so that I don't see any white underneath the ruler. So this yellow piece is the shortest piece, it's right on the very edge, and then we'll trim off the rest. And that will give us our cover. So I'm really happy with how that looks, and especially once I get the few finishing touches put on it, I think it's going to look really, really pretty. So at this point, you can take and fold it in half, and then you'll get a real good idea of how the cover is going to look. So I'm pleased with how this looks for me. You can see all the things on the cover that I really want to focus. I love the flowers. I even love the little ladybug, but of course I love my little girl and the fish. And for the fish, I know I said I was going to try to soften the mouth, and maybe I did a tiny bit, but what I really did was kind of make a mess of it, so I pulled out all the stitching. But I did go over the stripes on this fish. Underneath it had, I think it was some stars, and it just looked too modern, so I just went over it with some blue embroidery floss and turned it into stripes so that it kind of has the same feel as the ones up above it. And on the other fish on the back side, I did the same thing all along his back here. Let me move that up a little bit. Let's see if you can see it better. So along here, I just added in some more of that blue stitching because I didn't like the way it looked. And I added just a little bit of a red stitch along there as well. I would rather that it wasn't orange and that this one wasn't pink, but it's not something that jumps out and is super noticeable. Although if you're using fish like this and it bothers you, you could cover the whole thing and then you just have to add the eye back. But I'm okay with leaving it the way that it is. And so if you flip it over, then you also get a really good idea of what the back is going to look like. So I think it's really pretty, and I really, really like how it's turning out so far. I like the way flowers come down the back. So that's how the whole cover looks at this point. Now I'm going to add in some of my extras. So I think it was this button that I thought I would put there, which I think is still very cute. So I'm going to do that. I still have this really pretty flower sequin. I'm not sure which way it's supposed to go up. Maybe this way. And I do think it would look really pretty kind of right in there somewhere. So I'll add that in. And then I'm going to put some little flowers in this basket. So I'm going to go away and just add a few of the little final details, and then I'll come back and show you what I've done, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so I wanted to come back and just show you how I was attaching a couple of these things. So for this larger floral sequin, I added a smaller sequin in the middle, and then I just did a French knot right in the middle of that. So it's completely loose. Other than that, it can spin even if you want it to, but it's completely attached because that knot in the middle is not going to let it escape. So that's how I do that. That's how I did this smaller sequin here as well. I didn't need to put another one in the middle of that because it was fine for size already. And so, and even on when I made the little girl, that's how I attached all these sequins, was I just put a French knot right in the middle of them. So that works really well. And I've attached one of the buttons that I want there. But what I wanted to show you is how I'm going to attach the beads, because beads are a little trickier to get them to attach than sequins are. So I've done the first one here, and what I've done is added 3 threads that go around from the outside to the inside, and that way I know for sure it's not going to go anywhere. So I'm going to show you how I do that. I'll do that with the red button or bead. So what you want to do is come up from the back a little bit beside where you want the bead to go. And then, so you see, whoopsie, I've come up there, and they're very tricky to hold on to. I've come up there, and I want the bead, I really need to go even a little bit farther out to the edge. So there. And so I come up as though I'm on the edge of the bead, and then I'm going to go down into the center hole. So once you get that edge piece come up, then you adjust your bead where you want it and go straight down through the middle. And that gives you your first one. Now that in itself would hold it on, but it just, to me, it doesn't look balanced and it doesn't look very pretty. So I'm going to do 3 on each. So for the second one, again, you do the same thing. You want to come up, just kind of play until you find the right spot, right on the edge of the bead, and then go straight back down the hole in the middle. And then I'm going to do the same thing one more time on the very edge, so that each one has 3, and then it makes it almost look like it's got little petals, these little flowers. So of course, I'm sure there are a million ways to attach beads, but this is how I'm going to do it. So I thought I would give you an idea of how that's going to look. So I'm going to go and attach now my last one, and then I will move on and do some other embellishing. All right, so I'm back and I'm happy with how this is looking. I don't feel like I want to make any more changes at this point. That's not to say I never will in the future decide to add some little things on, but for the moment I'm pretty happy with how it looks. So as you can see, I've finished adding those little beads on the back, so it looks like there's flowers in the beach bag. And on the front, I really still felt like this section here needed something more, so I decided to add a couple more buttons there. And I think that's part of the reason it's really nice to have options and choices when it comes to buttons and materials, because you don't really know what you need until you're at a point where you're like, yeah, there's something missing there, and then you've got some options to just try and see what works. So the other thing I did was I actually folded it in half so I could see what the front cover would look like. And that's when I felt like, you know what, that still just isn't right there. And then I added the buttons, and I feel like it is now. And then when I flip it over, I feel like that's got everything that it needs on the back as well. So I'm happy with how this looks. So now we can go on and attach the closure. So for the closure, I had this idea. I don't know if it's going to work or not. So I'm going to show you what it is, and then I'll do mine so that you can see if we'll see if it actually works or not. And if it does, then I will come back and show you how to make it. But I'm going to wait to do that until we see if it actually works. So I wanted to continue with the slow stitching for the closure as well, and not just use a ribbon or something like that. So I made this piece out of, maybe if I take the cover away you can see it better. I made this piece just out of bits of leftover fabric, and the base of it is this piece that we just trimmed off of the cover. So make sure you don't throw this part away. It doesn't matter if it's got writing on it, you're not going to see it, but it's nice to have as a base for it. So hang on to those. As always, hang on to your bits until you're done the project. So my idea is to add this button here on the front and to add this piece on the back, and then have it when it's closed. Let's get it right here. When it's closed, have it so that this piece comes and wraps around the button a couple of times and just hangs down. So that's the idea. We'll see if it works. I am going to go away and do that now. And if it works and I'm happy with it, I will come back and show you how to do it. Okay, so that actually worked. This is kind of what it's going to look like. What I'm going to do to finish it off is put 3 buttons on the bottom, but I'm going to wait to do that until I've got the signatures added to this journal and have it bound. Sorry, they're hard to make them sit on there. But I'm going to wait until I've got the signatures in and have it bound so that I can see how thick it is and how much, so I know how much of the little ribbon we're making here that I want to hang down. And I want to put the buttons near the end of it just to give it a touch more weight to keep it down once that's done. So I'll show you how I did that. It's not hard. It's totally not hard. So the first thing I did, and you can decide whether how much of this you want to do for yours or not, and depending on the size of your button. But what I did is added a piece of thickened batting covered with fabric behind the button to raise it enough to allow this to wrap around it, because this is quite thick compared to, you know, a regular ribbon. And so it works, but you do need a little bit of room there for it to wrap around. So I raised the button up a little bit. So how I did that was I took some of the batting that that we had used for the back. So this is just a piece that was cut off. And I just grabbed a button and cut a circle around the button. It doesn't need to be perfect because you're not going to see it. And I just cut around the button so that it was 2 layers thick. So you end up with just 2 layers of batting. You can just kind of trim it up so it's got even edges. And then I grabbed a piece of, and depending again on which button you used, it will depend on the color of fabric you used. This is actually the right side of the fabric, but I want this piece to disappear. I don't want it to be visible. So I'm using this back side because it's very similar in color to the button. So you want to put the 2 little pieces of batting on the back side of the fabric that you want to cover up, and give yourself, you want to cut it into a square behind it. If you really want to do it perfect, you could cut it into a circle and gather it and so forth. That's not how I do it. I don't spend extra time on things that I don't love doing. So you put it like this, and then you fold the corner in, do a stitch through the middle, fold another corner in, do a stitch through the middle, and do that all the way around. So you've got kind of like a square with these pointy ends, and then I folded in each pointy end once and did a stitch through, so that in the end you end up with kind of this little octagon or hexagon shaped thing, but it's got a little bit of thickness to it. And then you take and attach this part first to the place where you want your button. So kind of lay your button down and tuck this under it, and attach this piece with a couple of stitches to the front cover first. And you still don't have any You still don't have your backing on, so you can go through. It doesn't matter what it looks like at this point. So attach that, and then once you've got that attached, sew your button on top of it. And do try to go through your buttonholes a few times so that you can make sure that it's strong. Now, if you have a shank button, I don't really have a big one, but let's say I use this one, which was a little bit, I wanted to use it, but it was a bit small. And if you have a shank button that has this piece on the back, and if it's big enough, you don't need to add the extra batting underneath, because this might be big enough to wrap around, but it would have to be quite a big shank in order for it to be big enough. So once you've got that sewn on, your button sewn on, then you just want to make this piece that wraps around. And it's really, really simple to do. And I specifically wanted mine to look a little bit kind of ratty looking. And so after I made it, I scrunched it up a little bit and let some of the threads come off. And then I trimmed a few of them back a little bit, but I want that look to have it just a little bit scraggly. And as you wrap it and unwrap it around your journal, that will change or make it more scraggly as you go as well. So how you make this is you take your one of your pieces of backing from when you made your cover, the pieces that we trimmed off, and you want to just trim it into a long thin strip. So I'm going to trim this off. It doesn't need to be perfect, because that's, unless you want it to be perfect, but that's not the look I'm going for. So I'm just trimming this off. And then I'm going to use my rotary cutter for this next bit just to make it go fast, but you don't have to, you can just use scissors. And so you want to trim a long, thin strip off of the edge of your backing. Now this is going to be too long, so I'm just going to cut it off there. So this piece is, what is this? It's about 10, 11 inches long. I think that's plenty long. This one is, yeah, the original one that I made was 13 inches long, but I'm going to be trimming probably a couple of inches off of that. So I think probably 11 inches is a good place to start. So all I did for this, let me grab my needle. This is where you want to use up all your little bits of fabric that you have left over. Even little pieces like this one. Like that's only 1/2 inch wide by just over 1 inch tall. So you take one of those pieces and you set it on top. Don't worry about getting it exactly the same width. We'll trim it down later. And then you take your thread and go up through the middle, and then just do a stitch down right beside it, a little wider. So you want your stitches to be about as like a little bit in from each edge, because you're going to be trimming it, and just go across. So they can be a little bit wider than this one was. So you can see if you just kind of hold it with both your fingers, you can bring that up, and we'll go down again. And you can choose whatever color thread you want to do this in. I'm doing a contrasting one here so that's a little bit easier for you to see. All right, now once you get closer to the end of this piece, then you need to add in another piece. And what I've been doing is you can either tuck it under or lay it over. I've just been laying it over. It doesn't matter either way, and I find that laying it over is a little bit easier. So once you get down to your last stitch, so I'm going to do a couple more stitches on this one because it's a little bit longer. once you get down to that last stitch. And see, I even went a little bit off, and it doesn't matter because we can pull it back over. You just lay this piece on right next to the last stitch and hold it there with your thumb and keep on stitching. It's a little bit fiddly because it's small pieces, but that's okay. It is slow stitching after all, so it's supposed to be slow. So basically that's what you do. You just keep on going. You stitch till you get down to part way down the end here. Then you add on another piece and stitch that far, and then you can just trim the edge. And then once you get the whole thing stitched, and with your thread, when you run out of thread, you want to knot it, and then on the back, hide your thread in between this backing piece and this front piece. So if, for example, if I was going to knot my thread here, the knot is there, and that's fine. But because this is going to get a lot of use, I want to make sure that it isn't going to unravel. So the way to avoid that is you knot it first, and then you take your needle and you thread it just underneath this last piece, your base piece here, and you just thread it up a ways. You can even put it in through some of these stitches that you just made in between the two pieces of fabric. And then you just pull it through and trim it. And then you don't have any loose ends coming out that are going to, let me just trim it for you so you can see. Oops. And then you don't have any loose ends coming out that are going to unravel. And you just keep going along the front. And then once you've gotten all the way to the end, I like to flip it over so that I make sure I'm not cutting through any of the stitching. And you just want to trim down the edge on each side. So that it's narrow, because what you want to end up with is a fairly narrow piece. And you can do that as narrow as you would like it to be. I find like this one is, what is this, about 1/4 of an inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch wide. The narrower you can make it, the easier it's going to be to wrap, but it doesn't need to be super narrow either. And then once you've got that whole piece sewn, you'll end up with a piece that looks kind of like this. And like I said, I showed you, I just sort of scrunched it up in my hands until I got some scraggly bits coming off of it, and that's the look that I want. Whoops, got this upside down. Once you've got that finished, you need to sew it onto the back cover of your journal. So when you've got your journal folded, you'll see your button on the front. If you just slide this slightly to the side so you can see the back, you want to lay this piece right side down in the same level as the button, but put it in a little bit. So you'll see mine is in, I don't know, maybe an inch or so. And then sew all the way around it, just going through the batting just to attach it. And then after you've done that, go through all the layers on the edge a couple of times, because this is the part that's going to get the stress, and you want to have that stronger. So once you've done that, then you've got your closure. And I may even trim this down a little bit more just to make it a little bit easier to wrap. You know, you can, I think I can get a little bit more off. You can even use bits of selvage on here. So I just tried to vary the colors along here so that it sort of matched the cover. And that's how I did the closure. So The next thing, after you get the closure done, the next part we're going to do is adding the backing. And you want to do that after you get your closure done because, I mean, look at my back. It's a hot mess. And that's okay with me because we're not going to see it. But you want to be able to cover up these parts that you've done. So that's why we're adding the closure first. So I'm going to show you now how to do that. And I'm going to give you a couple of different options for adding your backing. All right, so I'm going to show you two different ways that you can back your cover. So the first thing is you take your backing piece of fabric and you want to flip it over so that it's face down. And then you take your cover and put it face up on the fabric below. Now you'll probably be able to see the pattern a little bit through the fabric. So you can see if there's areas of the fabric that you maybe like more. In my case, I kind of like this top corner because it has more of the red and blue and yellow, and not like there are a couple of pink houses on here that I don't like as much. So I would put my piece up in this top corner like that. And then you just want to draw a line all the way around. So if you take your ruler and some kind of a marking tool, probably better to use something that isn't permanent, like this marker. I'm not going to actually mark it on this fabric. Maybe even a pencil would work. It's just a little bit lighter. And basically you just go around and draw a line and then cut it afterwards so that the backing fabric is exactly the same size as the cover. And then when you turn it over, let me just fold it under here to get a good idea. That's kind of what it's going to look like on the back. And you just want to do a blanket stitch all the way around the edges of the journal, through all the layers, and that'll finish the edges and make it look nice. And then when you're done, you can just fold it in half and bind your signatures in regularly. And in that case, your signature thread will come through the cover, which I don't think is a bad look anyway, but it depends on what you like. And the second option that I'm going to show you is actually going to have a hidden spine. So once you get your piece cut exactly the same size, then you want to start doing your blanket stitch. And do your blanket stitch from the front. And I would start down here somewhere in this bottom left corner, which is the back, because then if you have any problems figuring out around the corners or anything, you'll get a chance to do that all along here before you get to your actual front part of the cover where you want it to look especially nice. So I'm going to move this and I'm going to show you a different journal that I've done this on. And this one's not totally finished, but it gives you the idea. So I've just done this little strip here, but you can see how it finishes off the edge, and afterwards you can even take and just trim these little fuzzies off with your scissors. And then to go around the corner, you do a blanket stitch into the same hole 3 times as you go around the corner, and then keep going. And then you just do that all the way around the entire thing. And that will join your backing piece to your cover. And then basically at that point, your cover is done and ready to bind. So that's all the explanation I'm going to do for that one. If you do want to watch a little bit more about the blanket stitch and how that works, in my next video, I'll be doing that to the hidden spine cover. But I'm not going to do it in this video because there's another whole section that needs to be done first. So I'm going to set this aside and we're going to go back to my cover. So my favorite thing to use for journal covers is Amazon, the bubble wrapped mailers. So it looks pretty flat, but it does have a little bit of bubble wrap in it, and I like it because it's soft and squishy, and that's what I like. So you take your cover your paper, your Amazon cover. You could use cardstock as well. And what I did was put my cover right up to the edge so that I only need to cut around 3 edges, and then did exactly the same thing that you did in the other one, except instead of doing it on fabric, I did it on the paper. So I'm going to cut that out next, and then I will come back and show you what to do next. So I've got my piece cut out from my Amazon mailer envelope, and what I'm going to do now is glue my backing to this. Now, depending on how see-through your backing fabric is, like this one, you can see a little bit of a shadow of the writing, so I'm going to make sure that this goes on the blank side of my envelope, and that later my cover will go on this side that has the printing. And the cover is so thick that you're not going to be able to see anything through it, but the backing fabric you will be able to see through if you don't if you don't use the side that doesn't have writing on it. So at this point, I'm not even going to trim down my backing fabric. I'm just going to glue it straight to this piece of fabric. And I'm sure you've seen this a million times, done different ways by different people. I'm just keeping it super simple. I'm going to use Mod Podge, but you could also use PVA glue. And I'm going to just drizzle some on. And then I have a paintbrush here in some water. And I'm going to dab off most of the water because I really don't want this to be super wet. And basically I'm just going to do a real quick brush over this to get the glue spread all across. And if you have extra glue, that's okay. You're just wasting a little bit of glue. It's not that big of a deal. And as you can see, I'm going to have too much glue, because the one thing that I don't want is for a whole bunch of glue to be seeping through the fabric, on the backing fabric. So I'm trying to get it fairly close to the edges. We are going to be stitching around the edges, so it doesn't need to go right to the very edge, but I want it to be fairly close. And yeah, and then I'm going to take the Kleenex I used to soak up a little bit of the water from the brush and dab out the extra glue, and do that a couple of times. And that should be pretty good. So it's got a good amount of glue, but it shouldn't be enough to seep through. And what I'm also going to do is just let it sit for a couple of, well, not a minute, maybe another 10 seconds or so, until it starts to get a little bit tacky, and then it'll be enough to hold it down, but it won't seep through at that point. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of a wave here. All right, so that should be good. Let's try that. Now, this was the corner I liked that had the more blue and yellow. So I'm just going to very carefully lay this fabric right over top of the envelope and smooth it down. And it will be bumpy if you use a bubble mailer like I am, because the bubble mailer has bumps in it. But I actually like the texture of that. I like the feeling of it. So I'm fine with that. If you don't like that, just use either an Amazon envelope or some cardstock or something that doesn't have a texture to it, and then you won't have that. So yeah, I'm just smoothing this all down so that it's adhered everywhere. And then you flip it over and you can just cut off the extra. So this is going to be the inside of the journal cover. And so far, I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? So at this point, if you're doing a single signature, then it's extremely simple because all you do is fold it in half and crease the center. And then you know exactly where to bind your signature in because you've creased the center. And you could even, you know, put little marks there if you want. I'm going to do 2 signatures. So what I'm going to do is I fold it in half, and then I'm going to open it out and take my ruler. And I'm just going to measure, I want to make sure you can see the lines here. I'm just going to measure about 1/4 inch on each side of the center. 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, maybe a little less. Do that. At the top and the bottom. And you can draw right on your paper. You don't need to do it on a separate one. Okay, well, that seems slightly off, but I'll measure that again when I'm off camera just to make sure that those lines are exactly the same distance apart. Now, because my signatures are going to be slightly shorter than the book, I'm just going to put kind of a gauge here for, I want to make sure I'm not binding anything beyond that, because if my pages are a little bit short, I want to make sure that they're caught in at least 3 places just to give it some strength. So I'm going to measure down the middle. So this is just under 9 inches. So we'll do, we'll just leave the first one at 4.5, just to make it easy. So 4.5 from the top. Make sure I've got that right. And just do a line across the lines you just drew. And then I want the next hole for binding the signatures in about, I don't know, maybe 3/4 inch down from here. So just mark that, 3/4 inch there, and there. And then at the bottom, we'll do the same thing except 3/4 inch up. So there's my line, and there's 3/4 inch there and there. So these are the spots right in the middle of the X where I'm going to be binding in my 2 signatures. So the next thing I'm going to do is grab an awl. All right, well, I can't find my awl, so I'm just going to use a big needle. And I'm just going to take, and on each hole, I'm going to poke through. And so then when you turn to the other side, you will be able to see the hole that you made. And what I'm going to do is right on the fabric, on the hole on the other side, I'm just going to put a tiny little mark right in that hole with my permanent marker. You won't be able to see it because your thread's going to cover that up. But then when I bind from the inside, I know that that's where my signature is going to go. So I'm going to do that for each of these holes. All right, so once you've got all of your holes marked on the inside, I'm just taking a scrap piece of the bag that I used, and I've cut it exactly the same length as the height of the journal. And I'm just going to go in and you kind of put the edge of the crease right up against the holes. We want to mark this as the top. Make sure you get the top where the roofs are facing up. If you're using houses, if you're not using a directional fabric, it doesn't matter. And then everywhere there's a hole, the 3 spots, I'm just marking. And then you can set that aside and fold the crease the other way. And just go in and put a dot right in the center of the crease at the line, and that's how you know where to mark your holes in your signatures. Now, the other thing that I like to do, because I know that I'm putting them in a little bit, is I like to make a mark near the top and bottom. Let's do this, of my template here for binding, so that I know when I'm marking or when I'm putting the holes in my signatures, this line here is where I want the top of my signature to go, top and bottom of the signature. I'm going to put a B there and another T there. So you know that that's the top and that's the bottom of the signature. Even though this piece is the height of the whole journal, the signatures are going to be a bit shorter. So that's going to be your template for actually binding in the signatures. So you can just leave that exactly the way it is. You're pretty much done with that now, because you've got your holes on the inside marked where your signatures are going to go in. And if you just have one signature, you're just going to have 3 holes going right down the center. And this is where you're going to bind your signatures. You're going to bind them just into this piece that has the backing glued onto it. So you'll bind them just right in the middle, using a 3-hole pamphlet stitch. And for me, because I'm doing 2, I'll do one there and one on the other side. And then when you're done with that, you'll have a journal with an ugly cover, but the inside will be bound very nicely. And at that point is when we're going to add on the outside cover, so that it'll completely cover up your stitching on the spine. So it'll be a totally hidden spine for you. And then we'll just open it up like this. And at that point, we'll do the blanket stitch all the way around the outside of this. But because I'm going to bind in my signatures first, I'm not going to do that just yet. So that's what I'm going to work on in the next video, is adding the signatures. If you already know what you want to add for your signatures, you can get started on that right away. Or if you want to wait and do that with me, I'd love that too. I'm going to be using a bunch of different materials, including some vintage wallpapers and some digitals and some book pages from children's books. And so I'll show you that next week, how I put those together and get them bound in, and then we'll be adding on our cover and working at binding the edges. So we'll be able to completely finish this journal, at least the basics of it. I shouldn't say we're going to completely finish it. We'll be able to completely finish the binding of the journal. So it will actually be a fully complete journal without any of the extra stuff on the inside. And then the video after that, we're going to work on adding some more slow stitched things inside the journal that make it all pull together and use up some of your extra bits of fabric, and that I think are super fun. So we'll be doing some clusters and some belly bands and pockets and all that type of thing with the leftovers. So for now, I'm going to go away and get my signatures all put together how I want them to look. And when I come back for my next video, we will bind that together and finish off the cover. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks so much for staying with me during this, and I hope you're having fun making your cover, and I will see you next time. Take care.